The pension check barely covered the mortgage that month. After Richard passed, everything changed. 41 years of marriage, and just like that, I was alone in our little house in Kamloops, British Columbia, trying to figure out how to survive on a widow's income. Richard had been a carpenter, a good one. He built half the decks in our neighborhood with his own 2 hands. But carpenters don't get the kind of pensions that accountants or government workers do. When the heart attack took him, it took our financial security with it. I remember sitting at the kitchen table 3 days after the funeral, surrounded by sympathy cards and casserole dishes from neighbors, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every time I looked at them. The life insurance policy Richard had through his union was modest. It covered the funeral costs and left me with enough to pay off the credit card debt we'd accumulated over the years. But that was it. No nest egg, no safety net. I was 62 years old, and I needed a job. Now, I hadn't worked outside the home in almost 30 years. I'd raised our 3 children, managed our household, volunteered at the church, and helped Richard with the bookkeeping for his small contracting business. But none of that translated into a resume that would impress anyone. After 2 months of searching, I finally found a position at the Riverside Community Center, working as an administrative assistant. The pay was modest, but it came with benefits, and more importantly, it gave me a reason to get out of bed every morning. The center served seniors, running programs for fitness, arts, and social activities. It felt meaningful. Every morning, I took the number 7 bus from my neighborhood to downtown Kamloops. The route passed by the public library on Victoria Street, and that's where I first saw him. He was sitting on a bench near the library entrance, wrapped in a faded green army jacket that looked 2 sizes too big for his thin frame. His beard was gray and unkempt, his hair hidden under a worn Toronto Blue Jays cap. A cardboard sign leaned against his leg, but I never read what it said. I didn't need to. The first time I walked past him, he didn't ask for anything. He just nodded politely and said good morning. That small courtesy struck me. So many people on the street seemed to look right through him, as if he were invisible, but he still said good morning to everyone who passed. The next day, I brought an extra coffee. I didn't say much, just handed it to him and said I hoped he had a good day. He thanked me, his voice rough but gentle, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in his gaze that surprised me. Intelligence, awareness, pain. From that day on, it became our routine. Every morning, I would stop by the bench outside the library with a coffee and sometimes a muffin or a sandwich from the bakery next door. We would exchange a few words about the weather or the news, and then I would continue on my way to work. His name was Harold Patterson. He told me that much during our second week of morning conversations. I learned that he was a veteran, that he'd served overseas in places he didn't like to talk about, and that he'd been on the streets for almost 3 years. I never asked how he ended up there. It didn't seem like my place, but I got the sense that Harold's story was more complicated than most people would assume. There was something about the way he observed the world around him, the way his eyes tracked movement, the way he seemed to notice things that others missed. At the community center, my days were busy. I handled registrations, answered phones, managed the schedule for the various programs, and helped coordinate volunteers. My supervisor was a woman named Patricia Drummond, who had run the center for almost 15 years. She was efficient, if a bit cold, and she kept the place running like a well-oiled machine. The staff was small but dedicated. There was Mira, the young fitness instructor who taught the morning yoga classes. Kevin, the maintenance man who'd been with the center since it opened. And then there was Nathan Blackwood, the new accountant who had joined the team about 6 months before I started. Nathan was in his late 30s, with carefully styled dark hair and a smile that seemed just a little too polished. He handled all the finances for the center, including the donations that came in from local businesses and the provincial grants that funded our programs. I didn't interact with Nathan much at first. He kept to himself, working in a small office at the back of the building, emerging only for staff meetings or to pick up checks that needed signatures. But something about him made me uneasy. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to be watching, or the way his charm felt rehearsed, like he was playing a role rather than being himself. Richard always used to say I had good instincts about people. He called it my sixth sense. I'd learned to trust it over the years. 3 months into my job, I noticed something strange. I was filing invoices when I came across a receipt from a catering company for an event I didn't remember us hosting. The amount was significant, almost $4,000. I checked the calendar. The date on the receipt was a Saturday when the center had been closed for maintenance. I mentioned it to Patricia, thinking perhaps I'd missed something. She glanced at the receipt, frowned slightly, and said Nathan must have ordered food for the volunteer appreciation event. But that event wasn't until next month, and when it happened, I knew the budget was only $800. I let it go. Maybe there was an explanation I didn't understand. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I found another one. And another. Over the next few weeks, as I filed paperwork and organized records, I kept stumbling across expenses that didn't add up. A bill for office supplies from a company I'd never heard of. A payment to a consultant whose services were never rendered. Small amounts, mostly, but they added up. I didn't know what to do. I was new. I didn't want to cause trouble or accuse anyone of something I couldn't prove, so I kept quiet and kept watching. One morning in early October, I was running late. The bus had been delayed, and I practically jogged past the library, barely stopping to hand Harold his coffee. He grabbed my wrist. It wasn't rough, but it was firm. I stopped, startled, and looked at him. "Eleanor," he said, using my name for the first time. His voice was low, urgent. "I need you to listen to me carefully." "What's wrong?" I asked. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. His eyes darted around, scanning the street before settling back on me. "That accountant at your work. The one with the dark hair? You need to watch him." My blood went cold. "How do you know about my work?" "I know things," he said simply. "People talk when they think no one's listening. They say things they shouldn't say, especially when they're on their phones, walking past a man they think is just part of the scenery." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What did you hear?" "He's stealing," Harold said. "Money, a lot of it, but that's not the worst part." I waited, afraid to breathe. "He knows you're catching on. He's been talking to someone about what to do about it, about how to make sure you don't become a problem." "That's ridiculous," I said, even as my stomach twisted. "Why would he think I know anything?" "Because he watches you," Harold replied. "Just like you watch him. He's careful, but he's scared. Scared people do desperate things." I pulled my wrist free, stepping back. "This sounds insane." "Maybe it does." Harold's voice was calm, almost sad. "But I've been around long enough to know what desperation sounds like." And I heard him. "Eleanor, 2 days ago, he was on the phone right over there. He said he needed more time to take care of the situation. That the old woman in the office was going to ruin everything." Old woman. The words hit me like a slap. "Don't go home tonight," Harold said. "Stay somewhere else. A hotel, a friend's house, anywhere. Just don't go home." I backed away from him, shaking my head. "You're scaring me." "Good," he said. "You should be scared, but you should also be careful. Promise me you won't go home tonight." I didn't answer. I turned and walked to work as quickly as I could, my hands trembling around the coffee cups. All day, I couldn't focus. I kept replaying Harold's words in my mind, trying to convince myself that he was confused, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps misinterpreting something he'd heard. Homeless people sometimes struggled with reality. It would make sense. But then why did his words feel so true? I watched Nathan throughout the day. He seemed normal, smiling at staff members, typing away at his computer, taking phone calls in his office with the door closed. At one point, he caught me looking at him. Our eyes met for just a second before he looked away, but in that moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Fear. By 5 o'clock, I had made a decision. I would go home, but I would be careful. I would lock all the doors, keep my phone charged, and call my daughter Lisa in Vancouver first thing in the morning. Maybe I was overreacting, but maybe Harold was right. Either way, I needed to talk to someone I trusted. I took the bus home as usual. My neighborhood was quiet, the autumn leaves carpeting the sidewalks in shades of red and gold. My house looked the same as always, the front porch light on a timer, the garden beds ready for winter. Inside, everything was in its place. I made myself a cup of tea, locked the doors, and tried to read a book, but I couldn't concentrate. Every small sound made me jump, the refrigerator humming, the furnace clicking on. A car driving past outside. At 9:30, I decided to go to bed early. I checked the locks one more time, then climbed the stairs to my bedroom. I never made it to sleep. At 11:15, I was still lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard glass breaking downstairs. I sat up, my heart hammering. For a moment, I froze, unable to move, unable to think. Then I heard footsteps. Someone was in my house. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911 with shaking hands. I whispered my address to the dispatcher, told her someone had broken in, and then I heard the footsteps on the stairs. There was no time to wait for help. I had to move. Our bedroom had a door that led to a small balcony overlooking the backyard. Richard and I used to sit out there on summer evenings, watching the sunset over the mountains. Now, that balcony was my only escape. I opened the door as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold October night. Below me was a drop of maybe 12 feet to the grass. I'm 62 years old with bad knees. Jumping was going to hurt. But staying was going to hurt more. I lowered myself over the railing, hanging by my hands, and let go. The impact sent pain shooting through my ankles and knees. I crumpled onto the lawn, biting back a cry. Behind me, through the balcony door I'd left open, I heard a voice curse. I ran. I ran through my backyard, through the gate, into the alley behind my house. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the 911 call still connected. The dispatcher was asking if I was okay, telling me police were on their way. I ducked behind a neighbor's fence and pressed myself against the wood, trying to control my breathing. My lungs burned, my legs were shaking. For what felt like an eternity, I waited in the dark. Then I heard sirens. 2 police cars arrived at my house within minutes. I emerged from my hiding spot, limping, crying, barely able to explain what had happened. The officers took me somewhere safe and began searching my home. What they found made my blood run cold. In my kitchen, there was a jerry can of gasoline. Beside it, a book of matches. Whoever had broken in hadn't come to rob me. They had come to burn my house down, with me inside. I spent the night at my daughter Lisa's house. She drove 4 hours from Vancouver to get me, arriving at 3 in the morning with tears streaming down her face. I told her everything. About the strange receipts at work, about Harold's warning, about the break-in. The police investigation moved quickly after that. Nathan Blackwood was arrested 2 days later. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Over the past 18 months, he had embezzled almost $200,000 from the Riverside Community Center, siphoning donations and grant money into accounts under fake names. He had been planning to disappear, to start over somewhere else with the money he'd stolen. But then I had started noticing the discrepancies. I had asked questions. I had looked at files I wasn't supposed to look at. Nathan had panicked. He'd hired someone to silence me, someone who was supposed to make it look like an accident. A tragic house fire. An elderly woman who fell asleep with a candle burning. No one would have suspected anything. If I had been home that night, if I had gone to bed without hearing the glass break, if I hadn't run. I tried not to think about the ifs. The man who broke into my house was caught a week later, picked up on an unrelated charge, and identified through DNA evidence he'd left at my home. He confessed to being hired by Nathan, though he claimed he didn't know anyone was supposed to get hurt. Just a fire, he said. Just a little fire to destroy some documents Nathan was worried about. Just a little fire that would have killed me. After everything settled down, after the police had finished their questions and the lawyers had done their work, I went back to the bench outside the library. Harold was there, as always, sitting in his faded green jacket with his Blue Jays cap pulled low over his eyes. I sat down beside him. "You saved my life," I said. He didn't look at me, just kept watching the people walk past. "You saved your own life," he replied. "You listened. Most people don't." I was quiet for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. "How did you know?" I asked. How did you know what Nathan was planning? Harold finally turned to look at me. His eyes were tired but clear. I used to be an investigator, he said. RCMP. 32 years on the force. I worked fraud cases, financial crimes, the kind of white-collar stuff that most people never hear about. I stared at him, unable to hide my surprise. What happened? Life happened, he said with a shrug. My wife got sick. Cancer. I took early retirement to take care of her, but the pension wasn't enough to cover her treatments. We burned through our savings, then our house, then everything else. When she died, I had nothing left. Nowhere to go. Nobody who wanted to help. I'm so sorry, I whispered. Don't be. Harold's voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter. That's just how it goes sometimes. The system doesn't catch everyone who falls through the cracks. But you still have your skills, I said. Your training. You notice things about Nathan that no one else did. Old habits, he said, hard to turn them off. When you've spent your whole career watching people, listening to what they say when they think no one's paying attention, you don't just stop because you're sleeping on a bench instead of in a bed. I sat with that for a while. The morning sun was warm on my face and the leaves rustled in the breeze. I want to help you, I said finally. It's the least I can do. Harold shook his head. You already helped me. Every morning for months, you treated me like a person. You looked me in the eye. You said good morning. Do you know how rare that is? It shouldn't be rare, I said. It should be normal. Should be, he smiled. A small, sad smile. But it isn't. I took a deep breath. There's a program at the community center, I said. For veterans, they help with housing, with job placement, with getting back on your feet. I know it's not much, but Harold held up his hand, stopping me. I appreciate that. I do. But I've been in those programs before. They're not for everyone. Then what do you need? I asked. What can I do? He thought about it for a long moment. There's a shelter on the east side, he said finally. They do good work, but they're always short-staffed. They could use volunteers, people who actually listen, people who treat their clients with dignity. I can do that, I said. I know, he replied. That's why I'm telling you. And what about you? I pressed. Where will you go? Harold looked out at the street, at the people rushing past on their way to work, to appointments, to lives that had no room for a man on a bench. I'll be around, he said. I always am. Over the months that followed, I kept my promise. I started volunteering at the shelter Harold had mentioned, first 1 evening a week, then 2, then 3. I met people there who reminded me of Harold. Veterans who had served their country and been forgotten. Women who had fled abusive homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Young people who had aged out of foster care with no support system, no family, no safety net. I listened to their stories. I helped them fill out forms, navigate bureaucracies, find resources they didn't know existed. I brought coffee and muffins, just like I used to bring for Harold. Small kindnesses that cost me almost nothing, but meant everything to people who had been invisible for so long. Patricia Drummond resigned from the community center after the scandal. The board of directors brought in new leadership, someone younger and more transparent about how things were run. The center implemented better financial oversight, the kind of checks and balances that should have been there all along. Nathan's theft had exposed weaknesses in the system, and at least some good came from addressing them. I was promoted to office manager. It wasn't a glamorous title, but it came with a better salary and more responsibility. More importantly, it gave me a chance to shape how we did things, to make sure that the people we served were always treated with respect. Lisa worried about me at first. She wanted me to move to Vancouver, to be closer to her and the grandchildren. But Kamloops was my home. Richard was buried there. Our life together was woven into every street corner, every mountain view, every autumn sunset. I wasn't ready to leave. One morning in early spring, about 6 months after the break-in, I walked past the library on my way to work. The bench where Harold used to sit was empty. I stopped, feeling a sudden clutch of worry. Harold was always there. Every day, rain or shine, he was on that bench. I asked around. The librarians hadn't seen him. The shop owners nearby didn't know where he'd gone. He had simply vanished. For weeks, I searched. I checked shelters, hospitals, even the morgue. Nothing. It was as if Harold Patterson had never existed. I'd almost given up hope when a letter arrived at the community center, addressed to me by name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat, careful script. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. Your faith in me reminded me that I still had something to offer the world. I've reconnected with some old colleagues from my RCMP days. They've helped me get back on my feet. I'm staying in a small apartment in Victoria now, and I've started consulting on fraud cases again, just part-time, nothing too demanding. It turns out the skills you develop over 30 years don't go away, even when everything else does. I also wanted to thank you. Not just for the coffee and the muffins, though those meant more than you know, but for seeing me, for treating me like I was still a person, even when I had forgotten that myself. You asked me once what you could do to help. You've already done it. You showed me that kindness still exists in this world, that there are still people who will stop for a stranger, who will listen, who will care. That's a rare gift. Don't ever lose it. Take care of yourself, Eleanor, and keep making ripples. Your friend, Harold." I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet, where it stayed ever since. Some people believe that everything happens for a reason, that there's a grand plan guiding our lives, putting us in the right place at the right time. I'm not sure I believe that. Life has always seemed more random to me, more chaotic, more unpredictable, but I do believe in ripples. I believe that every small act of kindness creates waves that spread outward in ways we can never fully see. A cup of coffee given to a stranger becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a connection. A connection becomes a lifeline. Harold saved my life because I stopped to say good morning, because I looked him in the eye when everyone else looked away, because I remembered that the man on the bench was a man, not a statistic, not a problem, not someone else's responsibility. It cost me almost nothing, a few dollars a day, a few minutes of my time, a small acknowledgement that he existed, that he mattered, that he was worthy of basic human dignity. And in return, he gave me my life. I think about that sometimes. When I'm volunteering at the shelter, when I'm helping someone fill out a housing application or listening to a story they need to tell, I think about how close I came to losing everything, and how a man who had already lost everything was the one who saved me. We're all just a few bad breaks away from that bench. A job loss, an illness, a death in the family, and suddenly the safety net we thought we had disappears. The people we see on the streets aren't different from us. They're us, in different circumstances. They're people with stories, with skills, with dreams that got derailed by forces beyond their control. Harold was an RCMP investigator for 32 years. He caught criminals, solved cases, served his community, and then life knocked him down, and nobody was there to help him back up. Nobody except a widow with a cup of coffee and a few kind words. That's not heroism. That's just being human. It's remembering that we're all connected, that we all need each other, that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its most successful members, but how it treats its most vulnerable. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Be kind. Not because you expect something in return, but because kindness is its own reward. Because the person you help today might be the person who saves you tomorrow. Because every small act of decency creates ripples that spread further than you'll ever know. I'm 63 now. I still work at the community center, still volunteer at the shelter, still take the number 7 bus past the library every morning. The bench where Harold used to sit is usually empty these days, but sometimes I see someone new there, someone with tired eyes and a cardboard sign. When I do, I stop. I say good morning. I offer whatever I can. And I remember that we're all just people, trying to get through this life the best we can. Be kind to each other. You never know what ripples you're creating.